When the president-elect begins his second term, the Republican Party will control all three branches of government, giving Republicans full power in Washington. Before inauguration, the first orders of business begin today on Capitol Hill, starting with a House Speaker vote.
President Trump will return to D.C. and to the White House, and we will have Republican control of the Senate and the House. Things are going to be very different around here.
A confident message from Mike Johnson, whose future as House Speaker rests in the hands of his party. To keep his seat, Johnson will need support from almost every House Republican.
We cannot wait to get started.
However, since December's spending bill fiasco, some party members are expressing doubts he should remain Speaker.
He doesn't have my vote.
Rep. Thomas Massie already vowing to oppose him, while several other Republicans are non-committal. Aaron Covey, House editor at the Cook Political Report, says Republicans should want to elect a speaker quickly, which may increase Johnson's odds.
They need to certify the results of the election, and I don't think anyone wants to delay that too much, and they need a speaker in order to do that.
Their slim majority may soon shrink by 3, with Matt Gaetz' departure and Reps Mike Walz and Elise Stefanik likely to join Trump's cabinet. Covey says the administration will want to pass as much legislation as possible in the next 2 years due to the risk of losing the House in the midterms.
This time, the Trump team and the people he surrounds himself with are a lot more loyal, a lot more in lockstep with his own priorities. And so I think that there is going to be, they could potentially be able to get more done than they were able to do in the first administration.
The GOP in the new Congress has 3 main priorities: renewing Trump's tax cuts from 2017, passing a border security bill, and rolling back the Biden administration's energy regulations.
There's only certain types of legislation that can pass through reconciliation. So there's now a question of whether or not they try to do this in one major bill, or whether or not they try to split it up into 2 bills and tackle border security and energy.
Meanwhile, 2 incoming senators are making history by bringing greater representation to Congress. Democrats Angela Also Brooks from Maryland and Lisa Blunt Rochester from Delaware become the first 2 Black women to serve in the Senate at once.
The Senate has historically been less diverse than the House. It's a smaller body, and their members are elected to longer terms, so it has been wider and more dominated by men than the House.
As for opening day's agenda, once a House Speaker is elected, House members can then be sworn in and new rules can be considered. One of those rules would make it harder to challenge a speaker once elected. It will require 9 Republicans to support a motion forcing a vote on ousting a speaker instead of just 1 as it currently stands. Michelle London, CBN News, Washington.
Well, CBN's chief political analyst, David Brody, joins us now for more. So, David, how involved is President-elect Trump in convincing House Republicans to vote for Speaker Johnson?
Well, he's very involved behind the scenes with phone calls. But even this morning, Gordon, he put out a tweet, a post, an X, whatever they're calling it nowadays, in support of Mike Johnson. Yet again, this is twice in 1 week. So he's all in for Johnson. It remains to be seen, though, Gordon, whether or not Johnson's going to get through on a first vote, a second vote, maybe over the weekend. Who knows at this point? He can only afford to lose 1. Chip Roy, first of all, let's go back. Tom Massie, one of those congressmen there, will vote no. So he's a definite no. So that's it. I mean, you can only afford, he can't lose anybody else. And Chip Roy from Texas could be a guy that votes no. And there's 12 others that could potentially vote no. So this is going to be dicey for sure, Gordon.
Well, don't Republicans realize that anybody outside the party, it looks like it's some kind of clown car, that you have this revolving speaker, revolving challenges to the leadership? It just really doesn't make any sense. And at what point are they going to stop being backbenchers and actually move into a position where they can govern the nation?
Well, it's such a great point, Gordon. And look, part of the argument here is that, well, who else are you going to put up? I mean, there's no one that can get to 218. Jim Jordan has been talked about. He can't get to 218 right now. Tom Emmer in leadership, Steve Scalise, none of them get to 218. So it's like Johnson or bust at this point. So that's been part of the argument here. But look, I think what we're seeing here is, and what we may see over the weekend, potentially even today, is some backroom dealing. So in essence, to get a Chip Roy as part of the House Freedom Caucus, he's a very conservative member, and some of these other ones, to get to yes on Johnson, they're going to want some concessions. And we can get into all of the minutia, but the bottom line is they're going to want to see some promises from Speaker Johnson about whether it be appropriation bills or changes to the rules package, all of that type of inner Washington stuff to get to yes. So this may just be negotiation at this point. He may fail on the first vote, but maybe win on a second or third. But yeah, it's interesting that it's coming at noon on Friday, Gordon, because you can call it high noon. It's like a spaghetti Western gone bad.
How much is fundraising? I know it played a dominant role in some of the previous challenges that, you know, immediately after or in the middle of it, representatives had a lot of fundraising mail, fundraising emails, and I'm standing for you against the rhinos and all of that. Is that going to happen this time?
Well, it could, but look, I think ultimately there's a mandate that President Trump has, and I think that ultimately is going to rule the day. I'm not quite sure. You know, a lot of attention's been made on this speaker fight, and it's going to get the headlines in the next 24 to 48 hours for sure. But the real headline and the real fight is ahead on what they call budget reconciliation, which we can get to in a moment. But that's going to set the agenda for Congress going forward and some of those big Trump priorities.
Well, let's get to that. Let's get to the reconciliation, the whole process. What do you think is first and foremost on the Trump agenda, and how likely is that to pass both houses?
Well, in terms of how likely it is, that's a good question. But the reason they're using the budget reconciliation process, and we won't get too much in the weeds, there's a lot to get through and sift through. But the reason they use something called budget reconciliation is it lowers the threshold. You don't need 60 votes in the Senate to pass it. You only need 51. Same thing in the House. It's a simple majority. So when you have a lower threshold, what they've been doing, I say presidents for a long time now, 26 times since the 1970s, is they're using that vehicle to get their major legislation passed through the House and Senate. You know, there was a time in America where there was a bipartisan consensus on big social and economic bills that signed into law. That's not the case anymore. They have to use a tactic, that budget reconciliation tactic. And so President Trump, starting January 20th, will use this process to pass three things. The tax cuts, he wants to extend the tax cuts, something on the border, whatever that something looks like, but it'll be border security, and energy policy, drill, baby, drill, as he likes to say. Those are the three things that will be included inside a budget reconciliation package, because that's the easiest way to get things done in Washington. Of course, in Washington, Gordon, as you know, nothing's easy.
No, it's not easy, but I do wonder, do you think some of the bomb throwers on the Republican side understand just how short the time period is? That if the Republicans don't get their act together and actually make something positive happen, that the midterms are just 2 years away, and they've got a very short time period.
No, I think they realize that, but they also, many of these House Freedom Caucus members, they're principled to the core. I mean, they came to Washington to cut spending and to not play the Washington games. And Speaker Johnson has decided to cut some deals with Democrats, but it's not just that. I mean, Speaker Johnson did not allow the 72-hour read rule on these bills for some of them the first time around as Speaker. And also, he said he would pass 12 appropriation bills, individual, and that never happened. It became a continuing resolution. They're tired of all of this, and they feel principally against some of what's been going on, even if it's at the potential demise of Trump's first 100 days at the beginning. We'll see. I think ultimately they'll come around, but it's going to be a bit messy.
Well, it's also the demise of the majority. These margins are razor thin, and if they don't have positive action, then that majority evaporates, and it's very hard to mobilize the base election after election. And I'm fine for standing for principle, but at some point in time, you've got to get something done, don't you?
Well, yeah, and there's also a couple of practical implications here, Gordon, if I may, which is number one, none of these members of Congress will get paid until a speaker is chosen, because then Congress actually begins. So that's number one. And number two, don't forget January 6th, of course, coming up, which is where they'll certify the election. If they don't have a speaker, they're not certifying any election, any presidential election. So there are a couple of practical implications as well.
All right. Well, David, thanks so much for joining us. I think you're going to have a very busy year.
For sure. Thanks, Gordon.